Ladies and gentlemen, Dimitris Christopoulos is the Vice President of the International Federation for Human Rights and Associate Professor at the Department of Political Science and History of Pantheon University in Athens. His publications reflect on civic commitment in the field of migration, minorities, citizenship, and freedom of expression. He'll be sharing his thoughts with us on the following topic. Can the EU-Turkey agreement on refugees be reconciled with international humanitarian law and the Geneva Convention? Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Dimitris Christopoulos.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be in this exciting country, thanks to your invitation. So I will start with a conceptual remark. In Europe, we tend to identify what is happening as a refugee crisis. This is wrong. There is no refugee crisis in Europe. A refugee crisis is a combination of reception crisis, of integration crisis, of social cohesion crisis, humanitarian crisis maybe at the end. But in Europe, we do not have a refugee crisis. We have a reception crisis, which is due to the fact that we do not want refugees. It's not due to the fact that we have a lot of refugees. So the reception crisis is the result of our will not to have refugees. 1 million refugees in a continent of 500 million could never be identified as a crisis. Second, we tend, after the EU summit of 19th of February and the conclusions after this summit of the European Council, we abolished the term refugees from our texts. So we have been qualifying something as a refugee crisis, but after February, the term refugee disappeared. And then on, we speak about wave through migration flows, which again is incorrect, because most of the people are of refugee profile. 45% of the population that entered the European Union the last year are Syrians, 25% are Afghans, 20% Iraqis, so 9 out of 10 coming from nationalities where you do have serious problems, wars, and so on. But this is not enough. What is important to show that actually we're talking about a mainly refugee flow is the fact that we're talking about flows which consist of primarily of children, 40%, women, 25%. No migrant goes along with his family to cross the world. Generally, migrants go first, male, young people alone, and then they invite their families. So that is why, conceptually, we have been twice wrong. It's not a wave through migration flow, it's not a refugee crisis. But why we were wrong? Are we that stupid? Is it a matter of lack of knowledge? It is a matter of lack of intellectual clarity? Why? I think that we will all agree it's not a matter of lack of knowledge. Of course, I know that we are not governed by great political animals, but it's not that much lack of knowledge. It's ideology. It is our ideology which constructs a certain ideological perception of the refugee, which is completely different from the ideological perception of the refugee we had when we signed the Geneva Conventions. As simple as that. So as Clinton would have said, it's the ideology, stupid. So, and actually it's this ideology that creates trouble in countries with no refugees. I was in November, a week before the national elections in Poland, and I asked my interpreter to tell me what is happening in the pre-election campaign. And she told me that 90% of the political discourse had to do with refugees, in a country where you had 27 refugees then. Which obviously means that this has nothing to do with the historical material conditions, but it has to do with the ideological perceptions in a country, which are completely irrelevant to facts. And so here we are not talking about a fault, we're not talking about a mistake, we are talking about a failure. And if you want me to go on trying to analyze a little bit this failure, I might question myself, why did the most disciplined students of austerity neoliberal politics in the 90s were the worst students of humanitarian law today? Why the students that never known capitalism without austerity, such as the Central and East Europe, are today the most ferocious opponents of humanitarian law and the very idea that a single refugee will enter their territory? Of course, again, this is not a mistake. This has to do with the emphasis we put in lessons of political liberalism and the emphasis we put in lessons of economic liberalism, which do not necessarily go hand in hand in human history, as the European history goes on teaching us. So, after this introductory conceptual remarks, let me go to my point. It will take 2 minutes about the EU-Turkish deal, because the question is a rhetorical question. The question is a rhetorical question in the sense that, of course, the EU-Turkish deal cannot be reconciled with the UN Convention for refugees. This is a bad deal. This is a bad deal for 2 reasons. The first is an operational political reason. You have 3 pillars in order to get the deal implemented. The first is Turkey, the second is Greece, and the third is the European Union. No one will do the job from the pillars. Turkey will not take people back, or at least it will take some people back, but it will be extremely difficult, because this has to change an ongoing pattern for the last 2 years in Turkey, having to do with people who return. Greece cannot do the work, because what is requested from Greece, it simply cannot be done in the circumstances of the Greek administration today. And the EU will not do it. Go to France and say that you will receive tomorrow Turkish citizens without visas. They will laugh with you. So nobody will do the job. And that is why politically and operationally this is a bad deal. But it's not only politically and operationally a bad deal, it is morally and legally a bad deal. Because it's a bribe. And we like bribes when it comes to commercial stuff. And that is normal. We buy off people and they give us something. But bribing is not good when it comes to human lives. So, actually, we have a system which tries now to put pressure to the Greek government in order to start returning people to Turkey. How can Greece do that? How can Greece do the dirty job of the European Union? There are 2 reasons. There are 2 ways of doing this dirty job. The first is to deny access to asylum. We have been good with this. We know the job. The second way is actually to examine asylum requests in a way which seems apparently legal, but in fact, it's not legal. And this is where the story of Turkey being a safe third country comes in the agenda. The Greek government has been largely pressured by the EU in order to incorporate in the latest law of the Greek parliament the fact that Turkey is a third safe country. Imagine. They've asked us to put in our law that Turkey is a third safe country. Shame. We did not do that. But what the Greek government did was actually, and what we are doing now, is de facto recognizing Turkey as a third safe country for people who come from Turkey. So whoever comes from Turkey, he submits his asylum request, and the authorities see that the guy is coming from Turkey, and then the asylum request is rejected on the grounds that he came from a safe third country. Attention. Turkey is not a safe third country, not because it violates human rights of my colleagues, academics, because it does what it does to the Kurds, to the journalists, etc. Turkey is not a safe country for refugees because simply these people cannot seek asylum there. So actually, once you return them, these people do not enjoy the status of a potential refugee in the country, and that's it. So we need urgently to revise the deal, to drop the deal. We make mistakes. We need to recognize the mistakes instead of being in a tunnel and continuing digging in the tunnel instead of leaving the tunnel. But apart from this, the EU-Turkish deal has extremely important collateral, if I might say, damages also. Because there are people who will keep on coming without being registered. That you will never avoid, that's humanity. There are people who already arrived in Greece, to Greece before the entry into force of the deal. So these people are stuck in Greece. And of course, you still have formally alive the Dublin regulation, which means that should the Dublin regulation return as a zombie to Greece now, not only we will have to face what we are facing, but we will have to face also people coming from the rest of the Northern European countries back to the first entry in the European Union. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, the European Union keeps on failing. We need to question that. Of course, there is no time for me to share with you my reflections on that, and I'm sure we have plenty of things to say on this matter. But we need to think about whether this failure is a symptom of a broader existential failure or crisis of the European Union, or simply a result, or whatever. As a result, as conclusion, I'd say, and actually this is a discussion we had yesterday with Christos Giacoumopoulos, that no political, no institutional system is entitled to be historically immobile. I mean, transition is a part of history, is an existential part of history. Things are changing. And what is important, at least, is not to reject transition to unknown destinations, because this is mission impossible. You need to integrate transition and try to do your best in order to avoid violence within transition. And this is where your responsibility is in. As civic society, as NGOs, as states, as international organizations, try to avoid violence, because the history of the 20th century has taught us that whenever we had such strong, harsh transitions in Europe, that was via war. So I think that today the message is not try to avoid transition, try to do our best in order to avoid violence for us and for our future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christopoulos.